Hi, I want to open by noting that our ongoing work as 4 white faculty is to acknowledge the racist history of the contemplative movement in the contemporary US and always to do better to reduce harm and be actively anti-racist in our attempts to create a supportive, joyous community in this academic experience that I'm about to describe to you, this 1-credit contemplative lab. So I'll introduce the course briefly, and then you'll hear from my colleagues about their experiences teaching with this lab. So we're interested in embedding contemplative approaches in the academic work that we do, rather than having it feel like an add-on or an extra. So as you know, our classrooms and our institutions already ask that we practice particular ways of being. And we're keen to demonstrate how contemplative inquiry as an epistemology, as a methodology, can enhance critical thinking, creative expression, problem solving, and ethical action. Also, the colleagues that you'll hear from, they're interested particularly in bringing course attention to process, to help students appreciate and play with a creative process that can be transformative rather than being committed to the creation of a perfect product. And so in summer of 2020, we developed a 1-credit course where students can engage in contemplative inquiry into their habitual ways of moving and speaking and listening. And then this lab is a co-requisite to home courses in writing and dance and music. So students meet separately in their home courses, and then we all come together once a week for 50 minutes to practice intentional approaches to our work, one another, and the creative endeavor that is our lives. And a salient point that arose both for students and faculty when we taught at Spring 2021 is that the creative process and the practice of one's art can transform us, which a focus on product and perfectionism denies us. And so what we want to look at going forward, and we hope to discuss in the live portion, is how we as 4 white faculty can do better to build an inclusive, beloved community in this academic experience. So what I'm showing you here is a draft of an open curriculum that I hope will release this spring that y'all will have access to. So the breakdown is awareness of self. There's a unit, awareness of self, a unit on connection to others, and then a unit on creative collaboration. And in that third part, the creative collaboration, that's where students, we really focused on sharing their creations with one another and making things together. They've shared works in progress through the whole semester, but at the end, Devin's public speaking students submitted speeches that Noel's sound study students created soundscapes out of, and then Kim's dance students choreographed to those soundscapes. And so now I'll walk you through the weekly topics. So feel free to press pause if you want to read any of this introductory material. But basically, we get to awareness of self, and we have some key experiences, key skills, and key concepts. And then no content in the first week, then intention. So rather than what you want to do, we focus on how you want to be. And we develop some guidelines as a class and as individuals about how we want to be in the semester together. The curriculum will have some framing and practices and activities. The next week was habits. So what are our intentional ways of speaking and listening and reacting? And we moved into embodiment. What does it feel like to be right here, right now? We had a week for review and connection. And then we moved in connection to other. And so comfort zone, curiosity, and growth. This was an inquiry into how individual students, what makes them feel open to change and growth, what prevents it, what helps them get curious. Then moving with care towards challenge. So how can we connect through difficulty, difference, and challenge? And then radical interconnectedness, which frankly became a pretty spiritual unit for a lot of folks in class. How do you experience interconnectivity, and with what? And so each of these elements from the lab were echoed and reinforced in the home courses. So for example, when we were working on habits, in dance, students analyzed their signature moves, and so that they could understand their habitual ways of moving and create anti-moves and try something different. In sound studies, students walked in familiar places and made field recordings so that they could witness their habitual ways of moving through space and hearing its sonic environment and shift into a new kind of listening. In public speaking, students noticed their habitual mind activity, their disaster narratives, and fears that came up when they're confronted with public speaking opportunities, and worked on transforming that habit of self-talk. And then in the lab, students could all get together in mixed groups and share their different but similar processes of noticing their habits. And that was really exciting for students to see how they did the same thing really differently in each of their home courses. And so in terms of assignment breakdown, again, you can press pause and read any of this at your leisure. We had practice, participate, apply, and reflect. And so participation was a key part in the class. Students had weekly practices, apply what they learned in their journals, and then reflect several times during the semester. We used an A through F grade scale the first time we taught it, but we're going forward, we're going to do credit, no credit. So there were a few elements of course design for student transformation that I'd love to chat with you about. So specifications grading, this was the first time in 17 years of teaching that I used specifications grading, and I received the greatest range of responses in their reflective writing and students' reflective writing. I think that spec grading freed students up to be more authentic in their responses because they didn't need to please me or tell me what I wanted to hear. Spec grading also allowed them to focus on process and gave them some choice and agency in when and how to do their work. And again, you can press pause. This is sort of cumbersome, and we are going to streamline this going forward. Like I said, we're not going to have the A through F scale, but if you want to read a little bit about specifications grading, you can do so here. So where the spec grading really came into play pretty powerfully was when students did their own assessment and specifications for class participation. So as a class, we came up with some ideas about what you might hope for yourself, what you would ask from your fellow students, and what you would like from me as an instructor. And then students also took some of these suggestions for how they might like to show up in class. And at the beginning of the semester, created their own specs, their own specifications for participation that they could then reflect back on several times during the semester. And this element at the end of the semester of reflecting on their participation specs was so powerful. Here, students are articulating how they're showing up and why, their sense of it mattering to them, how they are with others, being able to apply their dispositions and their way of showing up in other contexts. So again, feel free to press pause and read some of these student comments. I should say that we had 22 students in the class, and these are excerpts from just about everybody in the class. So you can read that at your leisure. And so specifications grading paired with the vulnerability and experimentation and play in the home classes that we got to echo in the lab, seeing other courses, we're also sharing works in progress that really opened things up for us in terms of course design and building a supportive, collaborative space for students. So now I'll turn it over to my colleagues to share their experiences.
Hello, I'm Devin. And for the purposes of this video, it might be helpful to know that for the last few semesters, I've been learning how to skateboard as part of a writing class I teach that looks at the learning process. The course I brought to the collaboration, however, was a public speaking course. And here's a little background on the course in terms of its goals, our question, and what I think was the answer. And feel free to pause and read through. But for the sake of time, I'm going to jump into notions of gratitude. To bear out what happened for me as both student and instructor in this class, I'll share one of the peer-to-peer validations I got from a student at the end of the semester. You are the most embarrassing professor I have ever had the pleasure to learn from. This semester you've really pushed me outside of my head and outside of my comfort zone, and I truly appreciate your teaching ability to have done that. To give this little context, I need to tell you about my gratitude buddy, Kidada, whose name I used with her permission. Early in the semester, one of our contemplative practices for the week was an option to reach out to a peer in the lab and exchange moments of gratitude throughout the week. Like many of the gratitude buddy partnerships formed in the class, ours lasted well beyond the week, and in fact beyond the semester. Later in the semester, when Kidada and I became something more like gratitude accountability partners, she reminded me of one of our homework assignments, to notice when and where one of our character strengths, coming from a character strength analysis quiz we took, showed up in our day-to-day experience. I texted Kidada that my top strength according to the quiz was humility, and that with her prompting I was able to see it at work in my learning process as someone who took up skateboarding in my late 30s. I told Kidada about one Saturday where I was practicing falling safely off my skateboard in an empty parking lot. After one particular tumble, I got up and was surprised to see a person right next to me, walking their dog through the lot, trying very hard to avoid making eye contact with me. Their discomfort was kind of palpable. I could feel the weight of their secondhand embarrassment, a burden we talked about often in the public speaking course. I wrote to Kidada about the moment because it helped me realize that my humility, I think, gives me a pretty high threshold for embarrassment when it comes to learning. which allows me to try new things even a little later in life. Just to be clear, it's not that I don't feel the embarrassment, or I don't recognize it as a feeling that many try to avoid. It's that I recognize it as a clear signal I'm getting outside of my comfort zone. So instead of something I try to avoid, it's something I try to welcome, if not actively seek out. Later that week, when I was elaborating on this moment for our weekly lab reflection, I had a kind of pivotal realization about my role as an instructor in a public speaking class. I knew that what had attracted me to the class was my own capacity for improvement, my own insecurities about speaking in public that I knew would allow me to be a legitimate co-discoverer with my students throughout the semester. And while I always value that authenticity of pursuit in a teaching experience, it can also be disquieting to feel too much like an amateur, to lend imposter syndrome any more fodder than it always seems to have. But what this realization did for me, as both student of my experience and instructor of the course, was show me that I was, in fact, guiding my students from a position of one of my strengths, my high threshold for embarrassment, and how it helps me dive into the creative process with something like joy and curious observation rather than judgment or anxiety. So for the final speech I delivered in front of my home course, I drew upon this realization for my customized mantra. One of the ways throughout the semester my students and I destabilized the transactional relationship between speaker and audience. Before I started my speech, I asked every student in the room to say to me, "Devin, you are so embarrassing." I want to note two things about this move. One, my ability and comfort in destabilizing my own authority in such explicit ways is in no small part a direct function of my privilege as a white male instructor. It is also, I hope, a useful interrogation and decentering of that authority. Because, and this is point two, I do not ask students to embarrass themselves, but to recognize their own strengths as learners and speakers, and to cultivate and explore those strengths within the space we make room for in the classroom, by interrogating and disrupting notions of product excellence inherited through patriarchal and white supremacist legacies. So I listened to my students as they went around the room and each gave me what I needed to succeed, what I needed to access and share with them a new part of myself, filled with their affirmations, at home in a new framework, and buoyed by knowledge of myself as a speaker, as a learner, and as an instructor. I met the goal that all students in the class set for themselves at the start. I delivered a speech that would have seemed well beyond my capabilities before our collaborative intervention.
Hello, I'm Kim, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the home course that I brought into this collaboration, dance composition. So dance composition is a course meant to expose students to multiple approaches to the choreographic process through the exploration of tools for movement generation, improvisation, and crafting movement in space. In this class, we focus on identifying individual habits and personal aesthetics and preferences in order to expand upon our ability to listen, perceive, and make connections as dance practitioners and makers. So essentially, we are working to establish individual practices and processes as artists. I'm going to show a few student quotes, but I'm not going to read them all, so please take a moment to pause if you'd like to read. So one of the main parts of the class consisted of 4 movement study projects completed over the course of the semester that aligned with one or more of the 3 themes of the Contemplative Lab. The first 2 fell under awareness of self, the third fell under connection to other, and the final project was an opportunity to synthesize the discoveries from previous projects under the contemplative and creative processes section of the lab. The first project was to create a movement signature solo and began with activities intended to increase self-awareness through written reflection and movement exploration that encouraged students to consider their movement and dance lineages and how these influence the development of their individual movement preferences and aesthetics. As they worked to identify and acknowledge their habits as movers, they built movement signature solos that afforded them the opportunity to indulge in strengths and movements that brought them kinesthetic delight and joy. This was an attempt on my part to help the students start from a place of confidence, allowing them to focus on existing embodied knowledge before asking them to lean into discomfort. One student noted that the NASCAR method we learned at the beginning of the semester in the Contemplative Lab gave me a method to understanding my habits, learning where they come from, and assessing how I wanted to deviate from them. So this idea of deviation came into play when we went into the second mini-study, in which I asked students to generate an anti-signature solo that focused on movements and qualities that felt less familiar, fell outside of habitual ways of moving. So students supported one another in this exploration through collaborative improvisation that led to conversations around perfectionism and perceptions of beauty that connected really nicely to discussions taking place in the Contemplative Lab about the toxic nature of perfectionism and the ways in which it hinders the creative process and can prevent transformative experiences. So the final two studies involved connection to other through the creative process. So this was either relating to another dancer, relating to space, the architecture of the space, relating to music or the sonic environment, and considering how these were all interconnected. One other through line of this course that was loosely connected with the weekly contemplative practices was a low-stakes weekly solo practice that I employed to cultivate, explore, and build upon students' strengths as dance practitioners. So students were asked to set an intention, so determine a task, a prompt, or an impulse, for a 5 to 10 minute improvisational solo practice that resulted in the development of a very brief choreographic phrase. Toward the end of the semester, the dance students received as impulse for one of these solos sonic material from the sound studies students that had been developed from audio material that came from the speaking in public students. So something that began with the speaking in public students went to the sound studies students and then ended with the dance composition students, and they created brief solos based upon those studies. And that was shared in the weekly lab gathering. So one student noted, my experiences with my peers in the contemplative lab helped to enhance my experience in my home course of composition. It was hearing my peers be vulnerable and share their creative process of what contemplation meant to them that helped me get past my roadblocks that I faced throughout the semester in composition. So in the spirit of embracing vulnerability and rejecting perfectionism, I'm sharing this brief offering inspired by my colleague Devin's presentation in words. It was created in the same way that I asked my students to do their weekly improvisational practices. And I would also like to take this moment to acknowledge that I identify as a white cisgendered female and that my dance lineage comes primarily from the study of Western concert dance forms and practices. I carry these practices along with my background in somatics and my body, and these lenses inform my approaches to dance composition. As I share with my students, traditional Western concert dance spaces are tied to whiteness and patriarchal systems that privilege white heteronormative bodies and narratives. I continue to work to dismantle these systems in my classes and resist perpetuating them. I hand it over to Noel.
We studied sound art, animals, nature, the way that sound connects us all, hyperconnectivity, radical interconnectedness, the politics of sound, wars and attacks using sound and vibration, weaponizing it. How is sound politicalized? How is sound heard? How is it felt? Who has access to sound? What is deep listening? What does a person gain when they can't hear? What's the difference between noise and sound? Music and noise, listening and hearing. What kind of things can be communicated through sound? How can species communicate through sound? Listening to the Earth's climate change, What have we been missing all this time when we've been ignoring sound and what it conveys? What will we gain when we open our ears up? What will we learn?
The practice of deep listening, as it has developed, explores the difference between hearing and listening.
I'm sitting here right now with you in the train station castle.
I am sitting in a room different from the one you are in now. I am recording the sound of my speaking voice, and I am going to play it back into the room again and again until the resonant frequencies of the room reinforce themselves.
Does that make sense?
Improving from sound studies, anthropology, composition, and to explain speaking sound artistic practice, yada yada yada.
What's the difference between sound and noise? What's the difference between sound art and music? Can you compose silence?
How's interspecies communication possible?
How sound transforms space.
How can we hear... Wait.
How can we hear anthropology?
Does that make sense?
Our eyes close. Our mouth shuts. Our nose clogs up in the winter. Our foot falls asleep. We experience ourselves, our histories, and human and non-human beings around us through our senses' doorways, each providing us a unique understanding and interpretation of reality, and most of which can be shut off when convenient. But our ears never close, and whether we realize it or not, we are always hearing the world around us. Many of us in the Western world don't emphasize hearing as a useful mode of interpreting the world around us, or even creating art as we do visuals. We miss out on an entire arena of experience just because we maybe weren't paying attention. Through a combination of musicology, anthropology, sound studies, and composition, we seek to transform the way you hear, learn from your personal interpretation of sound, and workshop creative soundscapes together.
I'm fourth year at UVA, and I can honestly say that this course has been the most impactful one I've taken. I think this is the only course I've ever taken that's really centered around learning and not grades. And I think this has even helped me develop a healthier view on life, because I never believed that great things could come out of low-stakes, process-focused environments rather than product-focused environments. However, sound studies has taught me both about the integral, existential, and socio-political role sound plays in our lives, and has helped me grow as an artist, an individual, in ways that I honestly could not have grown on my own.
Wait!
So something that was really cool about sound studies was I was actually able to co-design some of the classes, and it was really cool because we were already being given these really interesting, engaging topics, and then we were encouraged and allowed and given the space to dive even deeper to them and choose the parts of the materials that we really liked and bring in stuff kind of from our own lives that really resonated with us and was really it was really fun, honestly.
So I hope you got a small taste of the course structure. and also a sense of the experience of this lab and its affiliated courses, of the ways that we as faculty have supported one another's explorations, bringing some curiosity and a willingness to be transformed to our encounters with one another, which counteracted a culture of competitive performances of perfection that faculty can sometimes get into. And also with our students, the way we try to model and create spaces for students to find their own way of contributing to and receiving from the learning community. This opening quotation by Adrienne Marie Brown is a guiding star for us as facilitators of students. We are not there yet. I think that amongst ourselves, we have achieved this final part here, true selves extending trust to each other, making up the most efficient working body. I believe we spent no time on posturing, repression, backdoor organizing, and lies, and that we were doing work that we were excited about. And so we have much to learn about how to facilitate such experiences for our students as well. So leading into the live discussion, we want to acknowledge that when building community in a course, as instructors, we need to recognize that not all students feel equally trusting or empowered to show up as their full selves, that invitation alone can be pretty triggering. As we mentioned, for white instructors and our students this last semester, about a quarter of whom were students of color, we really want to move at the speed of trust. And we recognize that invitations to show up and be vulnerable, that lands differently with different students. And in many ways, this lab is unbeholden to any content or any discipline. It has no reason to replicate some of the prescriptive and white-centered aspects of the field of contemplation. And instead, it really can be guided by Kai Cheng Tom's observation that choosing is more important than doing in a trauma-informed world. And we're crafting a course that privileges students' choice and agency in terms of what they practice, when, how, and what they do with their discoveries. So moving forward, one thing I intend to focus on, for example, is being more intentional and explicit about our values and opening a conversation about them and inviting students into that process of values exploration and enaction. We believe that creativity flourishes in many kinds of environments. The environment we attempt to build in this course values self-awareness, accountability, humility, integrity, and curiosity. And we strive to cultivate in students a spirit of curiosity that comes from a sense of settledness and safety, and a spirit of playfulness that comes from a sense of belonging. We eschew perfectionism, urgency, instrumentalism, and purely transactional relationships. And students will be invited to name cherished values and co-create an environment that supports and promotes them. So we're really excited to learn in the live discussion. We're happy to take questions, but feel free to reach out individually for that kind of conversation if you like. We're hoping that all participants may share and learn how to offer choice and to move at the speed of trust in a 15-week 4-credit contemplative experience that's designed to build community and support resilience and advance academic objectives. So we're also really excited for the live discussion to surface and celebrate pathways for faculty to care for one another, regardless of administrative support. And so we hope that you come prepared to share what community building looks like in different contexts, particularly for students and faculty of color in white tilted spaces as our course is, and also to celebrate the ways that faculty can nourish one another. Thank you so much for your time.